Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. It's October 27th, 2021, and the time is 9:30 a.m. This is the time and place set for Sacramento County to conduct an informative budget workshop this morning for the public. We're pleased to have each of you here with us today. I am Robert Bendorf, and I will be facilitating the workshop session today. The workshop is being conducted as part of the county's effort to enhance public understanding of the budget and engagement in the budget process. And we'll also include an overview of the general budget concepts as well as some detail on the county's budget. There will also be an opportunity today to go over questions related to the budget, but also an opportunity for comments from the public as well, which we will go over the different options on how to make those comments or submit questions here in a bit. But first, please allow me to introduce Sacramento County Executive Ann Edwards. Ann?
Thank you so much, Robert, and welcome everyone. It is my pleasure to be here this morning to introduce Sacramento County's budget workshop. As Robert said, we're conducting this workshop as part of the county's plan to enhance public understanding and engagement in the county's budget leading up to the fiscal year 22-23 budget process. As you will see from this presentation, the county's budget is very complex, and we hope this workshop helps provide you with information about our budget and budget process that is clear and transparent. We also want to hear from you, and there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions and make public comments at the end of the presentation. I will now turn it back over to Robert, who will explain how this is all going to work, and thank you again so much for joining us.
Great, thank you, Ann. So this morning, again, we'll be introducing somebody to deliver that budget information to all of you. But before we do that, we'll go over a few housekeeping items that we have relative to the presentation and workshop today. So we're first of all recording. The workshop's being recorded, so if you want to go back to it and maybe review an area that you didn't have an opportunity to be fully engaged with, it'll be available on the county's YouTube page, which can be accessed by going to the county's website at BDM, that's B as in boy, D as in David, M as in Mary, .saccounty.net. That's bdm.saccounty.net. So your input is really important, as well as your questions. So please submit questions today. The opportunity will be in the Q&A box that you can find on your Zoom toolbar. You'll see a section there that says Q&A, and that can be accessed again at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So also public comment, we will take a break for a few minutes after the presentation this morning, and after that break, we'll allow for public comment. And the information relative to the phone number that you can call in is available at the bottom of your screen. And I will also give you that number now, as callers will be put in the queue as we move along during the presentation. And that number is 916-875-2500. Again, 916-875-2500, and that is for public comment. All right. So without any further ado, I think we will move directly into the presentation this morning. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you Sacramento County's Chief Fiscal Officer, Amanda Thomas. Amanda?
Thank you, Robert, and thanks to all of you for participating. I, for one, appreciate your enthusiasm for learning more about the county's budget. And I will admit that having been in this position for less than 6 months, I myself am still doing some learning. Before I jump into the presentation, I did want to let everyone know that we'll be doing some polling questions that will hopefully liven things up a little bit. And to give you a break from my voice, Robert will be running the polls. As you'll see, these are meant to test your knowledge of the county's budget, and I'll let you know the answers to the questions after each poll. With that, let's get started. In terms of the overview for this presentation, I'll really be covering 4 areas. First, I'll cover some budget basics. Next, I'll go over some of the ways that you can get more information about the county's budget. After that, we'll take a closer look at the county's current adopted budget for fiscal year 2021-22. And finally, I'll talk about the budget process and timeline for next year's budget, which, believe it or not, is already underway. Let's start off with some budget basics. So what is a budget? Well, at its most basic level, a budget is an annual spending plan, which considers all the sources of funding that will be available during the year and plans how that funding will be spent. For the county and other governments, the budget also provides the legal authority to actually spend money and limits the amount that can be spent for specific purposes. And finally, a budget can be used as a way to set policy direction. But given the amount of work needed to prepare a budget under an already tight timeline, it is not a very effective process for developing policies. It may be more useful to think of the budget as a policy implementation tool, where it is used to implement policy decisions that have already been made. For example, some organizations have strategic plans that span 5 to 10 years and provide the policy framework for each year's annual budget. While we don't have this in Sacramento County, we are undergoing a process this year to develop budget priorities that would be implemented in next year's budget. And I'll talk more about that later. So now I will turn it over to Robert for our first question.
Which leads us to our first question, right on point with what Amanda had discussed, but also follows a timeline that is prescribed through either a county's charter, but also the County Budget Act. And the question that we have today is, what 12-month period is covered by the county's budget? A, January 1st to December 31st, B, July 1st through June 30th, C, October 1st through September 30th, or D, don't know, not sure. So the polling is now open. All right, we will close the polling, and if we can get the results on the screen. All right, so Amanda, I'll let you take it from here to provide all the congratulations.
Okay, well, this is obviously a very well-informed group, so thanks everyone for taking the first poll. The correct answer is July 1 through June 30th, which the majority of you got correct, which is referred to, and that's what's referred to as the county's fiscal year. So you already heard me use that term a couple of times, and that also aligns with the state's fiscal year. Okay. So let's turn now to look at the legal and policy framework for the county's budget, which basically means the rules that we have to follow in preparing and administering the budget. The first important set of rules is the County Budget Act, which is the state law that defines how all county budgets are supposed to be structured and approved. When I said earlier that the budget provides the legal authority to spend money and limits how much can be spent, this law is where that comes from. The State Controller's County Budget Guide is about 100 pages of detailed rules and requirements for implementing the County Budget Act, including instructions for certain schedules that are required to be included in the budget document. In addition to the County Budget Act, there are many other state and federal laws, rules, and contract provisions that impact the county's budget. Counties receive substantial funding from the state and federal governments, and rules for this funding include things like what we can or must spend certain money on, and whether we need to provide a certain amount of local funding. These laws and rules are why we really only have discretion in spending a relatively small amount of local resources, which I will talk more about later. In addition to state and federal rules, the county has its own rules spelled out in the county charter and county code, including describing the responsibilities of county officials in the budget process. Finally, in addition to legal requirements, any board policy direction would be taken into consideration in preparing the budget. For example, the board has adopted a general reserves policy that provides direction on how much money should be set aside in reserves during each budget year. And that brings us to our next question. Robert?
Great, thank you, Amanda. So the next polling question we have is, who is responsible for recommending a budget to the Board of Supervisors for their consideration? A, each department director. B, the director of finance. C, the county executive. Or D, the chief fiscal officer. The polling is now open. Okay, we'll go ahead and close the polling now, and if we can show the results. The county executive seems to be the predominant answer, but for further details, I'll turn it back over to Amanda.
Thanks, Robert. And yeah, once again, the majority of this group got the correct answer. So the correct answer is the county executive, and that is actually one of the provisions that's spelled out in the county charter. Of course, in addition to the county executive, there are many people involved in the county's budget process, including about 25 different county departments who are responsible for preparing a requested budget for the coming fiscal year and monitoring revenue and expenditures during the fiscal year. The fiscal staff in each department are really the experts on the revenues and expenditures associated with their departments and work with their department management to prepare departmental budget requests. The county's budget process is administered centrally in the Office of the County Executive. The Office of Budget and Debt Management, which I oversee, is a division of the Office of the County Executive, and our role in the budget process includes developing fiscal policies for recommendation to the Board of Supervisors, preparing discretionary and semi-discretionary revenue projections, which I will discuss later, providing budget instructions to departments, reviewing and making recommendations regarding departmental budget requests, and working with departments to monitor the budget status throughout the year. The County Executive Cabinet, including the Deputy County Executives, reviews information and recommendations regarding department budget requests and makes recommendations on funding levels to the County Executive based on available funding and alignment with county policies and priorities. As we already discussed, the County Executive makes final decisions and recommends a budget to the Board of Supervisors. The Department of Finance is responsible for administering the county's financial management system that contains all the data used to prepare and administer the budget, and also determines the final ending balances, ending fund balances at the end of the fiscal year. As already discussed, the Board of Supervisors provides policy direction and then reviews the budget recommended by the county executive, makes any revisions, approves, and ultimately adopts the budget. And finally, members of the public influence budget decisions by providing input, for example, by contacting board members or commenting at public meetings. So in the presentation up until now, I've referred to a budget, but it's important to understand that the budget goes through several stages before it's formally adopted. The first stage is what we refer to as the recommended budget, which is the county executive's initial proposed spending plan for the upcoming fiscal year. The recommended budget is submitted to the Board of Supervisors before the end of the current fiscal year and is generally available for review 10 days prior to the board meeting where it will be heard. The approved recommended budget, or what we sometimes just call the approved budget, is the recommended budget as revised and approved by the Board of Supervisors by June 30th. It authorizes spending for the first 3 months of the new fiscal year until the board formally adopts the budget. The revised recommended budget is the approved budget revised to reflect proposed changes, including things that could not be known at the time the recommended budget was developed, such as actual ending fund balance numbers and changes in the state's budget. This budget is also released 10 days prior to public hearings. The adopted budget is the budget formally adopted by the Board of Supervisors and is the revised recommended budget as revised by board actions at the September budget hearings. Each budget is made up of a number of components, including the basic budget elements that are listed here. The county budget includes multiple funds, which are discrete pots of money that have their own sources of revenue. In accordance with the Budget Act, funds are categorized as either governmental or other types depending on purpose. For example, the general fund, which is the main operating fund of the county and includes all discretionary revenue, is a governmental fund. Other fund types include enterprise funds, which provide services to the public like garbage collection or airports, and internal services funds that provide services to other county departments, such as information technology. Budget units are the level at which most budget authorization is made. That means that with some exceptions, during the fiscal year, departments can move expenditures around within the budget unit without board approval, but cannot exceed the total authority for the budget unit. However, moving budget from salary and benefits to another object like services and supplies requires board approval. Budget units often correspond to departments, but some departments have multiple budget units. Programs are discrete accounting units with expenditures and revenues that a budget unit is divided into. Fund centers are also discrete units of expenditures and revenues that a budget unit is divided into. Sometimes a fund center is the same as a program, and sometimes a program includes multiple fund centers. Fund centers don't appear in the budget document, but are in the county's financial management system and are used to track revenue and expenditures. Objects are groupings of like accounts, such as salaries and benefits, services and supplies, and equipment. And accounts are the lowest level at which we budget for and track revenues and expenditures. Examples would include things like retirement costs, office supplies, or professional services. Like fund centers, these do not appear in the budget document, but are in the financial management system. This slide lists some of the key terms and concepts that are important for understanding the county's budget and budget process, including some of the information that I'll be going over in the following sections. Appropriations mean the authorization in the budget to spend money. It is not a requirement that money be spent, only an authorization and limitation on spending at certain levels. Revenue is money that comes to the county from outside sources. At Sacramento County, we classify revenue into categories depending on how much discretion or flexibility the county has in spending the money. These categories are discretionary revenue, which is local revenue from things like property and sales tax that is not legally restricted in use. This is money that technically can be spent on any public purpose. However, the service mandates and local funding requirements that I described earlier limit how much of this is truly discretionary. The second category is what we refer to as semi-discretionary revenue, which is 1991 and 2011 realignment and Proposition 172 revenue. This is money we get from the state for specific purposes, but in many cases, those purposes are somewhat broad and there is some discretion in how the money can be spent, which is why we call it semi-discretionary. For example, Proposition 172 revenue comes from a statewide sales tax and must be used to fund public safety programs, but the amount that gets provided to which public safety program is up to the county. The third category is categorical revenue, or what you will also see labeled as departmental revenue. And that is revenue that is received by departments that must be spent on specific programs or services, and includes much of the state and federal revenue that funds health and social services programs, as well as the fee revenue paid by those who receive services like garbage collection or water service. Reimbursements means money received or held by one part of the county's budget structure and then transferred to another part. An example is semi-discretionary revenue, which is received in a semi-discretionary restricted fund and then transferred to the relevant operating budget in the general fund, where it appears as a reimbursement. Appropriations that are funded by reimbursements are double counted in the total county budget. Once in the fund that receives the revenue, and then a second time in the operating budget where the expenditure actually occurs. Net financing uses are total appropriations minus reimbursements and reflect what the total budget would be if there were no double counting of the reimbursements. Net county cost is a term we use to refer to the use of discretionary resources in the general fund. So this is an allocation of discretionary revenue and general fund available fund balance to fund appropriations in a budget unit that are not otherwise funded with departmental revenue or semi-discretionary reimbursements. I'll talk about the next two, available fund balance and reserves, together. At the end of every fiscal year, each fund ends the year with a fund balance, which is unspent money that is carried over from the prior fiscal year. This fund balance can be divided into two parts: reserves, part of the fund balance set aside for a specific future use, and the available balance, which is the unreserved portion of fund balance that can actually be used to spend on programs and services in the next fiscal year. In the general fund, for example, the available fund balance has historically been an important source for balancing the budget. As I said, reserves are the portion of fund balance set aside for a future specific use, and they can be generally classified as either restricted, meaning there are legal restrictions on what they can be spent on, or unrestricted, meaning the board has control over whether and how much to reserve. I'll also talk about the final three listed here together as well. And these are base, growth, and reductions, which are three key elements of a department's requested budget. Departments start by preparing a base budget, which is the budget year cost of current staffing and programs. In addition to the base budget, departments also submit additional growth requests, which are requests for new or enhanced programs above the base level. Sometimes these requests are funded by additional categorical revenue. In other cases, departments are requesting discretionary funding or semi-discretionary revenue funding for their growth requests. These are called unfunded requests. And total unfunded growth requests typically far exceed the discretionary or semi-discretionary resources available to fund those requests. Finally, the county generally does not backfill reductions in categorical revenue with net county cost or semi-discretionary revenue. And departments prepare reduction scenarios that describe what reductions will be made due to the loss of that revenue and what the impact of those reductions will be. In years where the fiscal situation is challenging, general fund departments are given targets for net county cost and prepare reduction impact scenarios if they have to make reductions to meet the target. This information is then carefully reviewed to evaluate whether it would be appropriate to restore some or all of the reduction, taking into account other needs and the general fund's discretionary resource availability. This list identifies some of the key issues that go into developing the county's budget. An important consideration is the county's role as a provider of both municipal and county-wide services. Municipal services are the services provided only to residents who do not live in a city, like sheriff's patrol, planning, code enforcement, water service, garbage collection, and road maintenance. County-wide services are services we provide to residents whether they live in the unincorporated area or cities. These include things like corrections, prosecution, and health and human services programs. Even though most discretionary revenue comes from county-wide revenue sources, because we have such a large unincorporated area, this revenue must also be spent on municipal services. A second consideration is our role as a provider of state programs, including mandated programs, versus addressing local priorities and services. As I've already alluded to, not only do we get much of the money for the programs we provide, especially the health and social service programs from the state and federal government, but many of the programs have level of service requirements that are not fully funded and or require us to spend a certain amount of local money. As I described earlier, for discretionary, semi-discretionary, and categorical revenue, the different categories of funding we receive limits our flexibility in how we can fund programs and services. And this is also impacted by the state budget. since we get so much of our revenue from the state. We often don't know exactly what the state budget will mean to us until after it is adopted in June. The final consideration I'll mention here has to do with the county's labor agreements. Salary and benefit costs are one of the largest components of the county's budget. The county has 30 different bargaining units, and agreements with those unions determine things like the cost of living adjustment or COLA that will be provided to employees each year, which can have a significant impact on county costs. So now that we've talked a little bit about what goes into developing the county's budget, I want to go over some of the ways that you can learn more about the budget. All of the information I'll go over in this section is available on the Office of Budget and Debt Management webpage at bdm.saccounty.net. First, I'll talk about the budget document. As I mentioned, every year the county produces 3 budget documents: the recommended budget, the revised recommended budget, and the adopted budget. The adopted budget reflects decisions that have already been made, while the other 2 documents are proposals to the Board of Supervisors that can be reviewed prior to budget hearings in June or September. The recommended and revised recommended budget documents include different information, but the basic format is similar. Because the recommended budget document is the most comprehensive, I'll use that as the example for this section. And it includes the county executive budget message, which provides a narrative overview of the budget, and the main budget document, including a section on general budget information, the summary schedules required by the County Budget Act, a summary of positions, budget unit detail, and a glossary of terms. In the next several slides, I'll go through some examples of the budget unit detail to give you a sense of the information that's included. So this is an example of some of the pages for the Department of Child, Family, and Adult Services to illustrate what the budget unit pages look like. The first page for a budget unit shows a simplified organizational chart for the department, a bar chart showing the staffing trend, and pie charts that summarize the financing sources by major source and financing uses by object. After the first page, there's a page that shows the total budget for the budget unit by program for the current fiscal year, the prior fiscal year, and changes between the 2. It also summarizes the revenue, reimbursements, and net county cost. There is also a page that breaks out the budget unit by expenditure and revenue object, and also includes a narrative explanation of the significant changes in the budget. And then following the pages for the budget unit as a whole, there are then pages for each program within the budget unit. So in this case, it is Child Protective Services, which is one of the programs in Child, Family, and Adult Services budget. Again, this is showing the appropriations, reimbursements, revenue by object, and net county cost. And although not shown here, there is also narrative information explaining the major changes by program. The program pages also include a listing of recommended growth and a description of what the growth includes. And that takes us to our next polling question. Robert?
Great, thank you, Amanda. So we have our next polling question. How many pages long is the fiscal year 2021-2022 recommended budget document? Less than 100, B, 100 to 400, C, 400 to 800, D, more than 800. So the polling is now open. And I think Amanda would agree, we want it less than 100, correct?
That would be easier, but perhaps not as informative.
Right. All right, we'll go ahead and close the polling, and if we can pull up the results. It looks like they're right on target. A majority of folks responding to the poll. And while we would love it to be less pages, like Amanda said, to keep it informative and to make sure that all of our services that we provide are fully explained. Amanda, you can take it from there.
So I will, and actually, in fact, interestingly enough, the correct answer is actually D, more than 800 pages. So at more than 800 pages, you can see that the budget document includes a wealth of detail. And if you have a specific question about a department or a program, it's the place to go to find more information. However, if you instead are looking for just a high-level overview of the county's budget, then the 8-page budget in brief document shown here is really a better bet. And this is a new document for us this fiscal year. And again, it is available on the Office of Budget and Debt Management webpage. And as you can see from the first page that's shown here, it really provides sort of overall information on where the county's money comes from and how it's planned to be spent. And then as shown here for Health and Human Services, the budget in brief also provides a summary for each of the county's functional areas, including major initiatives that are planned for the current year. So I encourage you to check that out on our webpage. In addition to the budget in brief, we're also excited to announce the launch of the county's Budget Explorer tool, which can be accessed from the Office of Budget and Debt Management webpage. This tool allows you to explore a breakdown of the county's budget by agency, budget unit, and object through a series of interactive charts. Once you click on the link from the webpage, you'll land on a page that looks like this. And then from here, you would click on the link that's indicated by the red arrow shown, and that will take you to this chart showing the overall county budget. The box on the left-hand side, outlined in red, shows totals for appropriations, revenues, and reimbursements, and use of fund balance. The tabs at the top, which are outlined in green here, allow you to switch the chart views. And then if you click on any bar on the chart, which is indicated here by the red arrow, it will allow you to drill down further into the budget. So after clicking, the next level of detail that you'll see is a breakdown by agency. And from there, you can click on any bar or agency name to drill down even further. So this will take you to a breakdown by budget unit within the agency that you clicked. For example, this is showing the budget units within the social services agency. And then you can click again to drill down even further. So this is showing you the breakdown by object within the budget unit, which is the lowest level available. And then as I mentioned, at each level, you can switch the view by selecting a different tab at the top of the page. So for example, if you click on the percentage that's shown here by that red arrow, it will display the selected data as a pie chart. If you click on the summary tab, it displays a summary data table for the current view. At any time, you can navigate back to an earlier view by using the breadcrumbs that are outlined in the red box here. And then there's also a help feature indicated by the question mark in the top right that will explain all of this as well. And that's a quick summary of the new tool, but I hope you all take a look or take the time to check it out for yourself. So in this next section, I'm going to go over the current fiscal year 2021-22 adopted budget in a little more detail. This diagram lays out the basic budget fund structure of the county's budget. And as you can see, the county's all funds budget totals approximately $7 billion of appropriations this year. $2.6 billion is for enterprise and special revenue funds, $3.4 billion for the general fund, and $989 million for restricted funds, which receive revenue and transfer it out to operating budgets in the general fund, as we already discussed. So for example, as indicated by that red dash box here. And then as I mentioned earlier, these reimbursements do result in a double counting of appropriations in the all funds budget. All right, Robert, that brings us to our next polling question.
Great, thanks, Amanda. So how many separate funds are included in the county's budget? Your choices are A, 12, B, 58, C, 177, or who knows? The polling's now open. All right, why don't we go ahead and close the polling, and if we can pull up the results. Amanda?
Okay, well, again, this is a pretty informed group. So most of the respondents selected the correct answer, which is 177. So as you can see, the county's budget is quite complex with 177 separate funds included. So let's turn now to show the all funds budget in a different way. So this chart is showing that out of the 7 billion total in appropriations, approximately 5.1 billion or 74% is from operating budgets. Approximately 1.3 billion or 19% are non-operating budgets. And this includes budgets like the restricted funds where the money is transferred into the operating budgets. And then there's 492 million or 7% for the other budget types that are shown in that bar chart off to the right. And we are going to jump right into our next polling question, Robert.
All right, so for polling question number 5, which functional area has the largest operating budget in terms of total appropriations? Health and Human Services, Land Use, Development and Transportation, General Government and Support Services, or Public Safety and Justice? The polling is now open. All right, why don't we go ahead and close the polling and let's pull up our results. Everybody must have got it right, so there's no need to pull up the polling results. There they are.
Well, it looks like once again, the majority selected the correct answer, and we'll turn to the next page where we can see what that is, which is that, as you can see, looking at this pie chart, Health and Human Services is the largest functional area with the most appropriations in the county's budget, and that's represented by that large yellow slice of the pie there. So this chart is showing us the all funds budget by functional areas, which is really reflecting the general types of services provided by those areas. The green other category that's shown on this chart are the non-operating and other budget types that we saw on the previous chart. So everything else are the operating budgets. And when we look at it this way, we can see that that 1.93 billion or 28% is Health and Human Services. And that includes departments or programs like health services, child and adult protective services, homeless services, and various assistance programs. Many of the programs we provide on behalf of the state fall into this area. The second largest functional area, and I think this was the second most popular selection on the poll, is Public Safety and Justice at 1.12 billion or 16% of the total budget. This includes departments and programs like the sheriff, probation, the district attorney, funding for the courts, correctional health services, and the public defender. And then the next largest is Land Use, Development and Transportation at 812 million or 12% of the budget. And that includes departments and programs like planning, transportation, code enforcement, and airports. So if we shift gears just a bit now to look only at the general fund budget, which again includes most of the county's operating departments and is where local discretionary resources are budgeted, the general fund budget totals approximately 3.4 billion. And you can see that while the total amount of funding for Health and Human Services is almost the same as in the all funds budget, so there's 1.89 billion here compared to 1.93 billion on the previous chart, Health and Human Services programs represent 56% of the general fund budget compared to just 28% of the total county budget. Similarly, the amount of funding for public safety and justice is almost the same in the general fund as in the all funds budget, but the functional area is 33% of the general fund budget compared to only 16% of the all funds budget. On the other hand, the general fund includes only $22.5 million in land use development and transportation functional area, which is just 1% total appropriations in the general fund, compared to $812 million or 12% of the total county budget. So this reflects the fact that many of the programs that are budgeted in this functional area are budgeted in special revenue or enterprise funds that are financed with dedicated revenue. This chart shows how much of the general fund budget is funded by the different categories of revenue we discussed earlier. The largest share of the general fund budget, $1.3 billion or 39%, is funded by departmental revenue, with the vast majority being the federal, state revenue received to fund health and human services programs. At $844 million, semi-discretionary reimbursements that I discussed earlier are 25% of the general fund budget. And this funding also mostly goes to health and human services programs, but also to a lesser extent to public safety and justice programs. And discretionary revenue and reimbursements total $740 million, accounting for 22% of the funding, and use of available fund balance in the general fund, which is also a discretionary funding source, represents another $171 million or 5%. And that brings us to our next polling question.
Great, thanks, Amanda. So what is the largest source of county discretionary revenue? Income taxes, sales taxes, property taxes, or none of the above? And the polling is now open. All right, why don't we go ahead and close the polling and let's pull up the results. And there you go, Amanda.
Okay, another correct answer by the majority. So let's turn to the next slide and we'll actually see the answer to this question. So this chart is showing us the breakdown of discretionary revenues, with the largest source being what most of folks who took the poll guessed, which is property taxes at $522 million or 70%. That's followed by sales taxes at $102 million or 14%, and everything else totaling to 16%, but nothing greater than 5%. I won't spend too much time on this next chart, but it shows the various components that make up semi-discretionary revenue. As you can see, it's quite complicated, but there are three broad categories, which include Proposition 172 revenue, 1991 realignment revenue, and 2011 realignment revenue. This is showing us the funding sources for each functional area, with categorical or departmental revenues represented by yellow, semi-discretionary reimbursements represented by green, other reimbursements represented by blue, and then net county cost or the use of discretionary resources represented by red. Looking at the first two, which represent the bulk of general fund spending, you can see that in health and human services, 54% of the funding comes from categorical revenue, 30% from semi-discretionary reimbursements, and only 6% comes from net county cost. For public safety and justice, on the other hand, 56% of the funding comes from net county cost, 25% comes from semi-discretionary reimbursements, and 16% comes from categorical revenue like grants. It's important to note that the proportion of funding that comes to a functional area from different sources is in many ways a function of the programs in those functional areas. Many of the programs and services in the public safety and justice functional area have historically always been a local funding responsibility. In health and human services, on the other hand, the opposite is the case. Many of the services we provide in this area can be viewed as federal and state programs that counties administer, but that are largely funded with state and federal money. Shifting gears a bit now to look from the budget data that we've been looking at to looking at some actual data. This table compares the actual net county cost or use of discretionary resources with actual discretionary revenue for each year since fiscal year 2016-17. And as you can see, in each year, except for the two most recent, discretionary revenue exceeded net county cost by a relatively modest margin. In fiscal year 1920 and 2021, discretionary revenue exceeded net county cost by a wider margin. And that was due largely to one-time factors associated with the COVID-19 pandemic. So this included the pandemic relief funding that was received from the federal and state government, higher than normal position vacancy rates, and reduced assistance caseloads. The difference between actual net county cost and discretionary revenue determines the general fund's ending fund balance. And this slide shows the recent history of that fund balance, which is and splits between restricted reserves, unrestricted reserves, and the unreserved or available balance, which is what's shown in the light green portion of the bar. And as you can see, up until fiscal year 2018-19, that balance was growing again at a pretty modest rate. In fiscal year 1920 and 2021, for the reasons that I just discussed, the county did see a substantial increase in available fund balance. And that brings us to what is our final polling question.
Great, thanks, Amanda. So polling question number 7, compared to other large counties in California, Sacramento County's discretionary fund balance as a percentage of total revenue is among the highest, about average, or among the lowest. The polling is now open. All right, why don't we go ahead and close the polling and let's pull up the results. Amanda?
Okay, thanks, Robert. So, so half of the folks chose the correct answer, which is among the lowest. So if we turn to look at this next slide, it will show that comparison for us. So our fund balance is actually quite low compared to other counties in California. And this chart is showing general fund discretionary fund balance as a percentage of total general fund revenue for the largest counties in California. And so that we're comparing the same year for everyone, this data is for fiscal year 2019-20, which means it doesn't include the fiscal year 2021 increase that we did see on the previous chart. As you can see, as of June 30th, 2020, our general fund's ending discretionary balance was at about 7% of revenues, while comparable counties ranged from a low of 9% to a high of 78%, with an average of about 33%. And this is important because maintaining an adequate general fund balance is a critical factor in ensuring fiscal sustainability, because fund balance can be used to cushion the impact of economic downturns when revenues decline, and often service needs and costs increase at the same time. But beyond simply comparing to peer counties, another way to determine what a healthy fund balance should be is to look at best practices. So the Government Finance Officers Association recommends that local government general funds maintain a discretionary fund balance that is at least equal to 2 months, which equates to 16.6% of annual revenue. Over the long term, increasing our fund balance to an industry best practice level would be accomplished by setting aside money in reserves during the budget process. Here I've listed some of the key factors impacting this year's budget and the outlook for next year's budget. So looking at the county's discretionary revenues, despite initial concerns about the potential negative impact of COVID-19 pandemic on discretionary revenue sources, particularly sales taxes, The county's discretionary revenues have largely held up. In fact, one-time factors related to the pandemic, including stimulus payments, enhanced unemployment benefits, and a shift in the way people have spent money during and after the lifting of restrictions, may be contributing to higher than normal sales tax revenues. Additionally, the county, along with other local governments, has received substantial funding from the federal government to respond to and recover from the pandemic. Most significantly, we were allocated about $300 million, of which $150 million has been received in local fiscal recovery funds under the American Rescue Plan Act. We're currently planning how that money will be spent, and we'll be making recommendations on funding allocations at the November 2nd board meeting. This spending is not currently reflected in the fiscal year 2021-22 budget, but it is expected to be included in budget adjustments this year and in next year's budget. Use of fund balance and one-time revenue is an important factor. You may recall from an earlier slide that approximately $171 million of general fund appropriations are funded with available fund balance, which is considered a one-time funding source. That means that once it is spent, it's not available for future year expenditures. Ongoing expenditures funded with one-time sources like fund balance are only sustainable to the extent that additional future revenues become available. Given the amount of one-time funding in the fiscal 21-22 budget, this will be a challenge for us in fiscal year 22-23. The county has a number of legal obligations that result in the need to spend money, but one of the most significant of these is the Mays Consent Decree, which is an agreement to resolve a lawsuit concerning the conditions of confinement in the county's jails. The fiscal year 21-22 budget includes over $40 million in expenditures related to the Mays Consent Decree, and significant increases are expected in future years. The county also faces potentially significant exposure in other ongoing cases. I've already mentioned the county's labor agreements, that the county's labor agreements have a significant impact on the budget. And historically, salary increases in these agreements have been tied to the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, as an indication in the change of the cost of living. While agreements impacting the fiscal year 22-23 budget have not yet been negotiated, the CPI in recent months has been very high at over 5%. The county also has a backlog of capital and maintenance spending needs for buildings, roads, libraries, and regional parks, with hundreds of millions of dollars in unfunded project needs. And finally, as discussed previously, discretionary reserves are critical for the county's ability to continue funding programs during economic downturns. While progress was made in enhancing reserves in the fiscal year 21-22 budget, they do remain below targets established both by county policy and best practices for local governments, and this will be an important consideration for us in future budgets. In this final section, I'll go over some of the information related to the budget process and specifically the timeline for the upcoming fiscal year 22-23 budget. So as you'll see from this timeline, preparing the county's budget is really a year-long process that moves on a pretty tight time frame in order to gather and analyze all the required information, make decisions, and prepare documents to meet the deadlines that are imposed by the County Budget Act. Right now, internal service departments and the Office of Budget and Debt Management are in the process of preparing the allocated cost plan, which determines internal service charges for county departments. Some other key dates in the current timeframe include today's public budget workshop and a planned board hearing in December to recommend budget priorities for fiscal year 22-23, which I will discuss more in a few slides. In January, budget instructions will be issued to departments and they'll begin working on their budget requests. They'll also submit their mid-year fiscal reviews in January. In February, we'll prepare the revenue estimates for the budget year, and the requested budgets will be due from departments. In March, we will bring the mid-year or second quarter fiscal review to the board, along with any recommended current year budget adjustments. And then we'll also prepare discretionary revenue estimates for the budget year. In April, the executive cabinet will make recommendations and the county executive will decide on growth requests, program reductions, and net county cost funding levels for different departments. In May, departments will submit revised budgets if needed due to the county executive's decisions. We'll write the county executive's budget message, complete preparation of the recommended budget document, and send it to the printer. The budget is provided to the board and released to the public at the very end of May. Then hearings on the recommended budget are held in June, and the budget is approved by the board. In July, after the end of the fiscal year, the Department of Finance determines what the actual unaudited fund balances are for the various county funds. Departments also submit requests for revisions to the approved recommended budget, and we revise our discretionary and semi-discretionary revenue estimates for the budget year. In August, the County Executive Cabinet and the County Executive will make decisions on the department's requested revisions to the approved budget. Departments will revise their budgets accordingly, and the revised recommended budget document will be finalized and sent to the printer. And at the very end of August, the revised recommended budget is provided to the board and to the public. Finally, in September, the board holds hearings on the revised recommended budget and adopts the budget. And then the budget process for the next year starts all over again. So yeah, as you can see, it really is a year-long process. I mentioned earlier that we will be recommending budget priorities to the board in early December, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about the process to gather input leading up to that. So over the last several months, county departments have conducted outreach with the county's advisory boards and commissions, on which almost 600 people serve, in order to get their input on priorities for the county's budget. And we received responses representing 59 boards and commissions with nearly 300 distinct issues or priorities identified. Some of the key themes that emerged from the responses submitted included homeless encampments and affordable housing, health and human services, mental health and alcohol drug services, parks and recreation, and transportation, including road maintenance. Starting this week, a survey of a representative sample of county residents is currently being conducted by a professional public opinion research firm that was hired by the county, and the questions in the survey incorporate themes from earlier outreach. The results of this survey should be available in late November and will help us determine the issues and priorities that are important to county residents, which will help shape recommended budget priorities for the board to consider in advance of the budget instructions being issued to departments in January. While the date is subject to change, we anticipate the recommended budget priorities to be presented at the board meeting on December 8th. And this slide shows the key dates for the upcoming budget process. I've already mentioned these on earlier slides, but thought it'd be helpful to put them in one place for reference, but please do note that the dates are subject to change. And finally, this slide shows where you can go to get more information or get more involved. So as Robert mentioned, this recorded presentation will be available on the county's YouTube page. And of course, you can email budget@saccounty.net with any questions you may have or input you would like to provide. We've already talked about the information available on the budget and debt management webpage. And this slide also includes links with information on the county's advisory boards, contacting your county supervisor, and signing up to receive information about the county's budget. In order to access these hyperlinks, please download this presentation at bdm.saccounty.net. That concludes my presentation. Thank you for listening. I hope you found the information useful, and I will now turn it over to Robert.
Great, and if we can leave that information up on the screen still, if we can go back to that, that would be great. And just as a reminder, before we take our 5-minute break, not to redo everything Amanda just stated on how you can get involved, but for today, there are several ways you can comment, submit comments, or ask questions related to the presentation on Sacramento County's budget. And everyone can choose from one of the following options. For public comments about Sacramento County's budget during the comment period of this workshop, which will follow the break, if you haven't done so already, please call 916-875-2500. Again, 916-875-2500, and that information is at the bottom of your screen. Again, calls will be moderated by the clerk of the board's office and taken in the order they are received. We're asking each caller to limit their comments to 2 minutes, and we will try to get to as many comments as time allows. If we do not get to your call, we'd still like to hear from you. And so the options, as Amanda stated, you can email at budget@saccounty.net. That's budget@saccounty.net. Or you can send a letter in or some type of correspondence to Sacramento County, attention Office of Budget and Debt Management, Again, that's Sacramento County, attention Office of Budget and Debt Management, 700 8th Street, Suite 7650, Sacramento, California, 95814. Again, and we'll have that information repeated again for you a little bit later on. And having said that, we will go ahead and begin the 5-minute break, and we will be back with you very soon for the public comment portion of this workshop. Thank you, everyone. All right, let's have a 30-second warning before we start the public comment portion of the workshop. All right, well, I don't have my handy dandy stopwatch with me. We will go ahead and begin our comment portion of the public workshop. And I would like to turn it over to the clerk of the board for any callers that we may have wishing to comment today.
Hello, this is Alma from the clerk of the board's office. There are no callers in the queue.
Okay, there are no callers in the queue. So what I'd like to do currently is turn it over to Amanda, if you have any closing comments at all, or to our public information officer, or to Ann Edwards, if there are any additional comments. If not, we will move forward with concluding.
Well, I'll just say, unless Amanda or Kim have something you want to say, I just want to thank everyone for participating. I hope that the information that was presented today you find helpful and useful. And please use those links if you want to provide additional feedback or have additional questions, and we'll be happy to respond to you. So thanks everybody so much. And thank you, Robert and Amanda, and our interpreters. Thanks so much.
Great, thanks for the opportunity again. As our CEO stated, there's numerous opportunities for folks to comment or ask questions. And keep in mind, there's also numerous opportunities for comment on Sacramento County's budget throughout the year prior to it being finalized for the upcoming fiscal year. So when that work begins, well, I don't even know if it begins, it is year round, I think. So having said that, we thank everyone for joining today. To all the Sacramento County staff, our interpreters, I appreciate your hard work, and thank you for being here today.
Thanks, everybody.